So, this video is dealing with same-sex marriage. Thanks, Tyler, for joining us, or me, I guess, us for anybody else who joins and watches. So, my personal views on it is that it should be legalized. It's predominantly constitutional grounds, First and 14th Amendments, previous Supreme Court decisions, things of that nature. And you?
I agree with you on that, but for me, it's more about why does the government have a say in who's allowed to get married. I don't think the government should have that authority. The government isn't for deciding how people live their lives. It's for protecting the people and providing for its citizens if necessary.
Yeah. And for the most part, I agree. I think that the bigger issue that is brought up with that is that since the government doesn't necessarily bar, at least at the federal level, the government doesn't bar you from getting married. DOMA, in this case, bars 1,100 federal benefits from being conveyed to those who are married in same-sex relationships. So I think that I agree on the count that the states shouldn't be telling you if you can or can't get married, within reason, of course. I'm fully in favor of not allowing pedophiles to marry small children. But other than pedophiles, I really can't think of anyone who would argue the other side of that issue. I could be wrong, but I don't think I am.
Yeah.
So that I think is why there's so much push for a law condoning it, because as it stands, there's no law prohibiting it at the federal level, just a lack of recognition. And so I think what's being pushed for is recognition at the federal level.
I'm pretty sure there's a few states at least that have laws that, and possibly their constitution doesn't allow it. That's against it.
Unfortunately, I am in one such state. The state of Ohio does not allow for same-sex partners to legally marry.
Neither does North Carolina.
Yeah.
I believe it's only 11 states that actually allow same-sex marriage. Or less.
I think that's accurate. I think it might be up to 13, but I'm not entirely sure.
It used to be 11. It probably is now 13.
Yeah. Real quick, I will actually check that. Okay. Loading. Firefox bugs me. But anyways, in the meantime, while I wait for the internet to function the way I tell it to, so I agree, those states that do allow it, and really I think it needs to be, and logically as a default, unless there's a law prohibiting it, it's legal.
It's sort of like not allowing, I mean, I understand it's same gender, but it's comparable to not allowing somebody of the Caucasian race and the African American race to not marry.
Yeah.
However, like I said, obviously different genders.
But the overall principle, that's actually the one court case, and I can never remember the name of the case. I'll look it up and I'll post it in the description of this video, so that those who are interested can find that. But there's a Supreme Court case that dealt with interracial marriage, and in that the court made the comment that marriage is a fundamental right and it is part of being human. And
it's a relationship between two people to decide.
Two consenting adults.
Not for the government to decide.
Well, and that's why. And the key there is that it makes sense societally for the government to create legal benefits to being married, to encourage marriage and stable homes and children and propagation of the country. So the legal benefits, it makes sense for the government to be involved in that capacity. You know, marriage, you get tax breaks, spousal benefits, Social Security, things like that. So that makes sense. It's when you get into the idea of, well, we're only going to convey that to this group, but not this group, that we run into problems. The government shouldn't be deciding who can get married, merely that if you are married, you receive these benefits.
And like I said, government should not be in the business of marriage. That's between the individuals, not the government.
True.
And I think it's an overreach. I mean, of course, it's not. It doesn't. How would I say it? Some people are against it because of their religious beliefs, and I understand that. But I don't believe that you should use the government to try to enforce your belief of people not being able to get married because they're of the same sex.
Yeah, I mean, we've seen the results of theocratic rule, where one group gets to decide what religion and what interpretation of that religion is allowed in the Middle East with the Islamic Republic of Iran. That they utilize Islamic law, but it's not by the letter of the Quran, it's by the interpretation of the Ayatollah.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's not even truly Islamic law. It's really a dictatorship with Islam used as the, well, I get to do this because book that you're not even literate enough to read says so, which was a tool used by the Catholic Church in the Dark Ages in a way to maintain its control. Though, for the most part, the Catholic Church, they did some things wrong in those times, but they weren't trying to blow up everybody else either.
Sure.
So there are distinct differences, of course, and no one group is responsible for all the bad things that occurred there. A lot of it was political and economic, but it was a tool used to maintain control and conformity. Was the fact that if you can't read the laws I pass or the book I'm using to base my laws on, then how do you argue against my laws? And so we've seen what happens when you let one religion and one interpretation go too far there. And the other side of that is that we do have the control of our government is based off of our Constitution, and the First Amendment, the key lines there, the establishment and the free practice clauses, free exercise clauses, Congress shall make no law respecting the establishment of a religion nor restricting the free exercise thereof. Which essentially has been held to mean that, for instance, using school prayer as an example, students are free to pray in their schools. Constitutionally, that is protected. What is not protected is the school coming in and saying, hey, you know what would be great? We should have a prayer time right now.
A school sanctioned prayer.
Exactly. The school cannot encourage, lead, force, or any of those things, the prayer. However, if I, as a Christian student, want to sit in my homeroom and pray before the day, the school can't tell me I'm not allowed.
Exactly, and I believe every American realizes that, or should, anyways.
Yeah, and there are examples where schools have confiscated Bibles and other holy books in the argument of separation of church and state. However, if any of those students were to choose to sue, there wouldn't even be a lawsuit. It would be over so quickly the school wouldn't know what had happened, and they'd be in deep trouble because that's an unconstitutional enforcement of it's a violation of the free exercise clause. So, and that's more my point, is that it protects me from having your religious views or my fiance's religious views or John down the street's religious views forced upon me, but it also prevents you from telling me that you don't like the way I practice my religion, so I can't. And so that's the part of it that it irritates me when people use a religious argument, because they can't. I mean, constitutionally, they're not allowed.
Which is why I believe, and I respect other people's religious beliefs, but I don't believe you should use the government to try to enforce that
Your
belief
religion
on others.
Exactly. And that goes back to the idea that if same-sex marriage, or as the term now is, if marriage equality were to be passed, there has yet to be a proposal that says your church must perform same-sex marriages. Because when they speak of marriage in this context, they're talking about the legal contract that basically the government's role is to witness. You're entering into the contract with another person. The government is basically witnessing and enabling the enforcement of said contract. A judge can witness that and perform a marriage. I mean, there's nothing that says that your church must be involved at all. Now, if you can find a church, like for instance, I'm a member of the United Church of Christ, which is one of the churches in this country that does endorse same-sex marriage. If I wanted to marry a man, they would perform the marriage in the church, and I'd still have to go to the government to get the marriage license and all of that, fill out that paperwork to receive the benefits of marriage. However, religiously speaking, I don't need any of that. I can get married in my church and consider myself married and tell people I'm married. I just won't be legally married. And I think that's the distinction people often miss, is that there's nothing that will force your church to do it, but if your church is willing to do it, great.
And I believe our society in the United States, they're changing their views on the issue. It's becoming more accepted. Just as racism racism is clearly still around today, but not as much as it used to. And it's comparable, same-sex marriage acceptance is comparable to how racism has declined over time. It's a societal change of opinion. And in this case, same-sex marriage.
Yeah. Okay. By the way, the page finished loading. There are 38 states that have banned same-sex marriage either through legislation or constitutional amendments. 6 states that allow civil unions between same-sex couples but not marriage. Colorado, Delaware, Hawaii, Illinois, New Jersey, and Rhode Island. And then at the time this article was published, which was in it was March 26th. There's 9 states that allow same-sex marriage and the District of Columbia. And they are Connecticut, Iowa, Maine, Maryland, Massachusetts, New Hampshire, New York, Vermont, Washington, and D.C. However, due to the Defense of Marriage Act, the federal government does not recognize the marriages of these states, and that denies them 1,100 benefits. And just to give a little background on the Defense of Marriage Act, because it's often viewed as having originated with a Republican Congress and a Republican legislature, that's redundant, and a Republican president, sorry. It was passed in 1996 under Bill Clinton as almost a concession to the Republican-controlled legislature in order to allow him to propagate the rest of his policies economically and socially with less resistance from them. So it's not okay in my eyes that he passed it, but I understand that it was that or lose everything else as well. But that's more the origins, and I don't know the basis on which they pushed for that, because it really didn't fit the rest of any agendas. But even now, Bill Clinton is urging for it to be repealed or overturned.
I'm pretty positive he even came out in support of same-sex marriage recently.
Yeah. Well, I actually got a link here, and I apologize if this turns out to be a video that interrupts our audio. It says, former President Bill Clinton, who signed the Defense of Marriage Act, is calling on the Supreme Court to rule the law unconstitutional. Quote, on March 27th, DOMA will come before the Supreme Court, and the justices must decide whether it is consistent with the principles of a nation that honors freedom, equality, and justice above all, and is therefore constitutional. And I believe he meant that it is unconstitutional. He wrote that in an online Thursday night for the Washington Post. He continued that as a president who signed the act into law, I have come to believe that DOMA is contrary to those principles and in fact incompatible with our Constitution. Said it was a different time that it was
I
passed. Blah blah
agree with
blah.
him. I'm for equality. I believe everybody should be for equality. I don't want to have a right that somebody else does it. I just don't believe that's fair. My
Yeah.
parents raised me to treat other people how I'd want them to treat me. And that's kind of like I don't want them not to have my rights. And I think
And you don't
everybody
want them to have rights you don't have. It's an
exactly.
equal. It's if I have it, you should have it, and if you have it, I should have it type of attitude.
And
And
that's
that's
half. And the other half, like I said, is I don't believe the government has the right to say, "Hey, you can't get married," because
yeah.
it's not what we
Um,
believe.
Now the other main arguments used include that it's unnatural, um, and that always disturbed me because usually the people making that argument are posting that online on a computer,
Well,
which is a man-made creation as well, as is marriage.
question for
But
you: do you
yeah,
choose to be heterosexual?
no,
Exactly. I don't choose to like women. I just do.
yep. Well, and
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 I'm
that's the
just
point. It also comes back to there's over 1,500 other animal species that have been documented to exhibit homosexual behavior. And then, in addition to that, I read an article, and I'll try to find it again and put it in the description of this video as well, in which a group of geneticists flipped a few genes on in fruit flies, which are commonly used for genetic experiments because of the rate at which they like to reproduce and their short lifespan. So you can get to generation 26 in a few hours. But they flipped on a few genes in the genetic code of one generation, and the next generation was almost completely homosexual.
that's interesting.
And
However,
humans have the same gene that they flipped on in these fruit flies.
if you think about, I'll hold off on that. It's a confusing thought. I'll come back to what I was going to say.
Formulate it, and then we can get into it. Yeah.
Yeah.
But then, yeah, absolutely. And I think that the other side of that is that if we assumed that it was a choice, which I think we both agree it's not, if we assume that it is, then that would also imply, I shouldn't say you're because you aren't implying that, then it is also implying then that they choose the ridicule and hostility and often open violence that comes along with being an open homosexual in our society today. Now, last time I checked, I don't like having the crap kicked out of me. I don't know how you feel about that. I'm going to guess you're also opposed to having somebody beat you up.
I am.
So we tend to make choices to avoid that situation. And so choosing to do that wouldn't make sense. Logically, you would choose to be below the radar, so you would either not come out or not be gay. And since there are people that are out and gay, probably not a choice.
And I just think that a big part of this is people's beliefs tend to get in the way of what the truth really is, and I think that's a problem with our
Emotion
country.
gets in the way of reason.
Yes. And I think that's a big problem with our country. So, I don't know.
I know
It
what
just
you're
kind
getting
of
at.
bothers me.
That Americans, and I shouldn't just say Americans, human beings, but we see it more here because we are also American and we live in America.
Yes.
So I can't speak for Great Britain, but I would imagine, since they're comprised of human beings too, that they do the same thing, relatively speaking.
Hmm.
We allow our emotions, which are a significant portion of who we are, to get in the way of rational thought that would allow us to make better decisions for the collective and even for the individual sometimes, out of fear or anger or jealousy. And it's something that we all struggle with, and I think some people have gotten a grip on being able to make rational decisions despite their emotions better than others. I like to think I'm good at it. I mean, I make mistakes too. None of us are perfect, but I like to think I've gotten pretty good grip on my emotions. But I think that that's a problem, and it leads to a lot of less than preferable decisions, both in our government and in our society.
And going back to what I said a few times, how I don't believe it's right. It's the job of the government to make certain decisions between individuals. That applies not just to same-sex marriage, in my opinion. That should apply to what you put in your body. If you take certain drugs or eat certain food or
Yeah,
whatever you could possibly
I,
think of.
I think that the government's hand in drugs and dietary issues needs to be one of education and information, not of restriction. For instance, I'm fully in favor of the government sponsoring and putting out the information on the side effects, good and bad, of smoking marijuana. But prohibiting people from smoking marijuana, I'm a little less okay with. And the same way with food. The mayor of, not the mayor, is the mayor of New York Bloomberg? He's the mayor, right?
Yes, he is.
Okay. New York, New York. The fact there's a city and a state, I always have trouble keeping their governor and their mayor separated. With the ban that was recently overturned, thank you God, on the size of your soda. I'm fully in favor of him requiring. I'm fully in favor of him requiring that companies put the dietary information on their sodas. That this size drink contains X calories and X amounts of sugar and blah 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 blah. Fully in favor of him requiring that. Banning people from purchasing them, not okay with that.
This is a very libertarian view, and it's a principle that I hold very dear to my heart, is being able to make choices as an individual and not having those choices interfered by the government. And that's just very important as a human being, because we have the ability to make those decisions and not have them made by other people.
Yeah. So would you agree that the government's role in these issues would be educational, not restrictive?
They should definitely. I mean, if I think they should educate, especially education about certain drugs and smoking, cigarettes, and whatever. And instead of trying to restrict certain activities that the individual has the right to make if they choose to do so.
Well, and that goes into our prison system, that the number of people we have incarcerated for possession of drugs, not even use of drugs, just you were caught with marijuana on you, is insane. And the amount of raw money that we would save simply by eliminating those laws and instead regulating them like we do alcohol. I mean, you can't drive after you've had so much to drink, so you can't drive after you've had so many joints. You know what I mean?
And I believe you should have the right to put in your body whatever you want, as long as you don't interfere with other people and harm them.
Exactly, and that's where if you created laws like that for, say, marijuana, and I realize I keep using marijuana as the example because it's the in drug to legalize right now, so people understand the arguments for it better and understand that drug better. That then you have the protections desired for the general public of, if you're caught high and driving, then you can get arrested. But if you're in your home, smoking a joint, relaxing in your basement, watching television, the government isn't going to come bust down your door and arrest you because, oh my God, you're smoking weed.
I just think that's a clear overstep of government, and that's just not what government is for.
Yeah. Okay. So I'm going to check.
It's a little bit off topic, but it ties in with how I believe.
Yeah, it ties in with freedom to choose and that. Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, and it was making the point of the government's role in regulating our individual lives.
So I suppose this video rather is about the government's role in personal lives, I suppose.
Yeah.
Rather than just same-sex marriage, but that's the best example.
Yeah, and it's the current example dealing with that, because with Prop 8 and DOMA both up for review by the Supreme Court right now, the decision is expected in early June, by the way, in case you weren't aware. But the outcomes, just briefly, I'll explain. I don't know how much you know about this. I've been following this rather closely, since it's one of my big issues that I fight for. That if Proposition 8 is overturned at the Supreme Court level, the implications of that would be that it would be likely, not guaranteed, but likely, that similar bans in other states would also be overturned. Which would, the 30-some states that have banned it legally would likely then be forced to allow it. Can't say for 100% certainty. It would depend on how strongly the Supreme Court comes down on that issue. And if they choose to not hear it at all, which is more likely, to be honest, then it will simply result in it being overturned as it was before it was brought to the court, but only in that circuit court. Yeah, only in the circuit court. Yeah,
So
Prop 8's the California ban. Well,
even if it's overturned in California, that's a big thing because
Yeah,
it
it
sets
says a lot.
precedent for other courts to make their decisions on similar issues.
Well, and then DOMA is a different issue entirely. If it gets overturned, it doesn't legalize gay marriage nationwide. What it would do, though, is that it would allow the 1,100 plus benefits that are being denied right now to any married couple that is homosexual in a state that recognizes that marriage. I don't know if it would force states to recognize the marriages from other states. Again, it all depends on how strongly the court comes down on these issues and on which side. I think it's unlikely that the Supreme Court will allow DOMA to stand, just given the shift in public sentiment over the past decade and the other changes that have occurred. But if it does uphold them, then that sets back the fight for marriage equality by many, many, many years, because it's very difficult to flip a Supreme Court decision.
But like I said, society in our country, at least, is making a change toward acceptance of marriage equality.
Well, I think in the past 5 years, we've seen 2 or 3 states in just the past couple of years legalize it, and very few have made pushes to ban it. So I'm going to check real quick to see if we have any input questions.
And I will do that too.
And then, assuming we don't have questions right now, I don't appear to have any, but I'm going to.
I don't either. I just have messages and likes.
Yep. Okay. Then, as with the other video, we'll leave the ability to ask questions open, and we can always do later a Q&A segment where we just go through all the questions from all the videos that we put out periodically, every 2 or 3 videos, depending on if we get enough questions, and address what we can. Thank you for joining us. It's been a great time talking to you, Tyler.
Same with you.
And I think we will conclude here.
Thanks again for you, and thanks to everybody else.